I had the tawfiq, like many of you, alhamdulillah, to go on ziyarah and visit Najaf, for example, or Karbala. I remember going to Najaf in 2009, and then 2013, and then 2015. Every time I had the opportunity, I remember the first time when I went, and I encourage and I invite all of you to go. I remember the first time I went, 2009, I was about 18, 19 years old, and it was really exciting for me because not only was I able to see this environment for the first time, but also on top of that, I was able to meet my idols and my heroes that I grew up following. For example, I'm a muqallid of Sayyid Sistani. So I had the opportunity to meet him, and when I met him, it was a life-changing experience for me. Then I also met the other ulama and the scholars, which was very moving for me. I met the likes of Sayyid al-Hakim, who was alive at the time. I met the likes of Ayatollah Bashir Najafi, and of course, Ayatollah Sheikh Ishaq Fayyad, who is an incredible scholar. But amongst this, in this journey in 2015, I also had the opportunity to meet scholars who were mujtahideen, who were teachers in the Hawza, who were not those individuals who were Maraj al-Taqleed or Ayatul al-Udma, but they were people who were very renowned scholars in their own right, and they were teachers and professors in the university of the Hawza. So I want to share something with one conversation that I had. It was some of us young speakers from America, and we had gotten the audience with these scholars, and they were giving us some advice. And I wanted to share this with you. You know, at the beginning, someone like me has a responsibility. At every Muharram, I check the statements, for example, of our scholars on what advice do they give muballighin. That is, when you're someone who's doing tabligh, what advice do they give? For example, Sayyid Sistani has influenced me a lot because one of the things that he says is, eradicate, remove the doubts that people may have in their mind about deen through logical sound proofs. And this is one of the reasons that I try to use the Islamic proofs as well as the proofs of the modern world that you would need in order to convince anyone in society today about these things. Or for example, Sayyid Khamenei, in his advice to speakers and muballighin who do tabligh, he says, for example, you know, people have gotten, and they know these things, so they know that people have gotten very used to and kind of tired of the old narrative. So he says, for example, either take that which has been said over years and present it in a new, fresh way that people can understand it for this era, or try to tackle some of those modern concerns that people are having. Because they understand deen is for you here right now. It's not for way back in the day. So keep this in mind. So now coming back to Ayatollah Sayyid Ja'far al-Hakim. Sayyid Ja'far al-Hakim is an amazing personality. He's from the very famous al-Hakim family. If you know, the al-Hakim family, if you go back into their history, of course, more famously, there was Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, who passed away recently. But before them, the Marja' A'zam of our time was by the name of Ayatollah Muhsin al-Hakim. Many of the elders will remember him. Now, I want you to share, this is that same family. Now, I want you to just understand some dynamics of this. Now, the Al-Hakim family, this family has given a lot for Islam. By the way, Al-Hakim comes from, they were actually ancestrally, their profession was doctors. But doctors for who? The rulers over the times, you know, the Persian Empire, the Safavids, they said, these are our doctors, our physicians. And so when you choose a physician to be your personal doctor as a ruler, you want the best mind, or no? You want just anybody? You want the best mind, so that if your life is on the line, your life is in this person's hands. So these were the brightest minds in that empire, so to speak. But alhamdulillah, they ended up going into the Islamic Hawza, and they did tremendous things in terms of Islam. And of course, they're Hussaini Sadat from this lineage. Now, stay with me. So we meet him, and he shares his story with us. Ayatollah Sayyid Ja'far al-Hakim, who's still there in the Hawza and still teaches, and he actually tours around Europe and America periodically to tell people about getting involved in the societies that you live in. So we're sitting there in Najaf, amongst the scholarship there, and he said, I want to share with you our experience living in Iraq during the Ba'athist regime. And he said, you know what? There was a circumstance and there was a time where there was such a pressure on the Shia community and the scholarship that eventually what was happening was everyone was fleeing the Hawza in Najaf. As you know, historically, the Hawza was not always in Najaf. The Hawza of Najaf was not always in Najaf. It's been in Hilla before, it's been in Kufa before. Of course, there's the university in the Hawza of Imam Sadiq and Imam al-Baqir in Medina. The first, of course, Hawza is of Rasulullah, where he's teaching Amir al-Mu'mineen, and Amir al-Mu'mineen's own institution. So, the Hawza has been in different places, for example. Now, stay with me. He said all of the scholars were leaving Najaf for Iran and other places. He said, my uncle, who was Sayyid Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, who was alive at the time, he said, if I leave, if someone like me leaves, maybe the Hawza itself will be in an existential crisis of survival or not. Because he was such a big personality. These, like Sayyid al-Hakim, Sayyid Sistani are big personalities who are kind of keeping these systems up, you know? And so he said, I'm going to make the decision not to leave. Sayyid Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim says. So Sayyid Ja'far is telling us this. I said, I made the decision, that my uncle made the decision, he said, I'm not going to leave. So him and the members of the al-Hakim family, roughly 10 to 11 of them, they made a commitment to stay there. Mujtahid comes from the word juhad, to struggle. He was committed to staying there. So they were unjustly, unfairly put in prison, including Abu Ghuraib, and they spent upwards of 9 to 10 years in prison for nothing, they didn't do anything wrong. It was just dhulm. And so he said, when we were in prison, I can't tell you the torture that they underwent, but you wouldn't want to hear it, believe me. Keep that to the side. But one thing that he said was they didn't even have their books. So what would happen was they had one copy of the Quran that was worn and torn, and Sayyid Sa'id al-Hakim would teach from that Quran and his memory to his family members and students from the al-Hakim family, and so he turned the prison into a Hawza. He turned the prison into a university. And so he began to tell them. And so he would tell them references off the top of his head. And when he told, eventually when they got out of prison and they went and looked back at the references, they were either spot on or 1 or 2 pages off at the most. But they were there. Now, I'm telling you this to understand the struggle through which Tashayyu has reached you and I. It's not been a cakewalk. It's not been easy for you and I to call ourselves followers of the Ahlul Bayt in 2023. There's been a lot of blood that has been spilled. If you read the history, for example, throughout the times of the likes of what Banu Umayyah used to do to the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, what Banu Abbas used to do to the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, what happened, for example, even in contemporary times, if you read the history of what happened, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, when they became afraid of the Shia community, in one day, the Ottoman Empire rounded up 70,000 Shias. 30,000 they put in jail, 40,000 they beheaded, they killed, in one day. You go further than this, you go to Lebanon, you will find in Lebanon, there are places in particular, that are particular where there were sisters, followers of the Ahlul Bayt, Shia sisters, who would use to jump off a cliff because they used to do such atrocities to them, just to survive and keep their honor and dignity. Why? Only because they would follow the Ahlul Bayt. You go to the history, for example, of Afghanistan, 120 to 30 years, you will find a person by the name of Abdul Rahman Khan. They called him the Iron Amir. And his massacres of the Shia community in Afghanistan. Thousands and thousands of people have been killed. Until this day, the Shias that are being killed in Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan and other places. Keep all of these things in mind, because I want you to remember that your identity went through tremendous struggles in order to get to you right now. And it's a gift from Allah that you are here. Now come back to Sayyid Ja'far. Sayyid Ja'far said, look, we went through the most difficult time in this era of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. But we stayed steadfast, we got tortured, we got our nails pulled, we got electrocuted, but we still undertook the education and we made the prison a Hawza. And he told us many other things, but he said, look, this was our struggle for Islam. And he looked at us, all these speakers from the UK and America, and he looked at us and he said, "What is your struggle for Islam?" And nobody had an answer. After some moments of silence, I gathered the courage to say, there's no words to explain the sacrifice of your family. By the way, if you know the history of the Al-Hakim family, nobody would have the courage because they've given so much. Anyways, and I said that maybe in America and Europe, there's no doubt the sacrifice that you've done to keep us alive and keep us up. But it may be where we live in America, Australia, and Canada, and likes, it's not so much that our challenge is physical. It may be more psychological. That is, in an environment where people misunderstand my religion and your religion, to still believe, to still practice, to still have that aqidah and that aqaid. Even when the media or the news says something wrong, or says that this is what Muslims believe, or this is the view of Muslims, and Muslims are this and Muslims are that, to still in that environment believe, that pressure, perhaps that it is, and there was an elaboration that I mentioned. That in America, sometimes people will say, did you know that Muslims say that if someone they leave, they apostate, they're to be killed. Oh my God, how intolerant these types of things. Just looking at one, angle of the whole picture. And these misconceptions, and still believing, it's a test. But, at the same time, where are we in that test? I want you to build on this for a second. Stay with me here. Let's say there's somebody living in a place like Pakistan or a place like Afghanistan, and every single day when they leave their house, they don't know if they're going to come home alive. They don't know if they come to the Imam Barga like you and I have just come to the Imam Barga, if there will be, God forbid, some violence and they're not coming home. These are not so foreign, I'm sure you know about these. I have shuhada in my family, you have shuhada, I'm sure in your family as well. Why? Only because of the love of the Ahlul Bayt. Now question for you. That person may struggle and struggle and struggle and go struggle just to survive. Or someone is saying, I'm living in remote parts of these countries, maybe Africa or India or Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iran, or you take your pick. And they're maybe struggling financially, maybe they're struggling economically, maybe they're struggling with their life, maybe they're struggling with all of these things because of their love of the Ahlul Bayt, their name and how they look and their perception. People say these are Shias, let's get rid of them. You're following, I hope, what's going on in Afghanistan right now, where the government was initially supporting the Shia community, but it seems like that support, they said they would support, but now they're backing off. And it's been an old script over time that people have not supported these communities, unfortunately. Now stay with me here. That person who struggled in Africa, India, Pakistan, wherever it is, and they sometimes even had to give their life, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, on the Day of Judgment, that person could go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, Ya Allah, you're going to put me in heaven? And you're going to put this guy, Shabbir Kirmani, in the same place in heaven? My family was hungry. My family was starving. My family struggled. My family was in prison. My family was unjustly. My family made the prison into a hawza. And he's Shia, I'm Shia, we're in the same place in Jannah. Whereas he had air conditioning, he had a nice house, he had a nice place, he had everything. How? Each person has to ask that question to themselves. You are here for a reason. And if you take a back seat and think that Alhamdulillah, I'm okay and my immediate family is okay, you may be missing the big picture. You have friends here who you have a responsibility to the broader society, the Australian society. You have a responsibility to those people who are suffering injustice in other parts of the world. What are you doing about that? What am I doing about that? You may say, okay, I have food on the table, I have a place to sleep, and I'm safe. Alhamdulillah, that's good, that's beautiful, that's fantastic. But there are people in Australian society that we have a responsibility to. You may say, who? Do you know the indigenous people, the local people, the native people in this land? Do you know what the incarceration rate is of the native children of this country, of Australia, the numbers I've come across is 17 to 21 times more than the general population. Why? Allah may ask you and Allah may ask me, you were living in that time, in that era, what did you do for that community that may have been oppressed for some systematic reasons? It doesn't happen by coincidence, number one. Number two, have you written? For example, you know you have a Department of Foreign Affairs, I imagine, right? Have you written to your representative to say that, look, I'm concerned as a member of Australian society about what's going on in, for example, Pakistan or Afghanistan and how minorities are treated. By the way, your Foreign Office, I just checked today, is accepting applications for women and children, rights. They're asking for papers. Tell us what to investigate. Tell us what to look at. How many of you have written papers there? I saw something from the Kingdom of Morocco. I saw something from this city and that's it. I didn't see anything from Afghanistan or anything from Pakistan. I don't know if anyone's written or not. Why? This group is tasked with investigating concerns globally from your governments. And I'm saying this to myself as much as I'm saying it to you. You may think that, oh, I'm here, life's good for me. But what about the responsibility to other people in other parts of the world? Are you absolved of that? Are you exonerated of that? My dear brothers and sisters, understand that you should understand the political process here. You should make your voice heard. Whether people listen or not, that's not the point. The point is, what did you do in your ability as someone living in Australian society to try to help reduce the suffering of innocent people around the world? And that's a principle within Islam. I want to share something with you. In America, if you go to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, the largest court in the land, the most powerful court in the land, and you go in there and you look at the roof, there's artwork throughout that library. The Library of Congress is the largest library in the world in Washington, D.C., where I was born. You go into that library till this day, you will see artwork, you will see a mural, an artwork on the roof of the Library of Congress in America, in D.C., in the nation's capital. And it has an image written on it of the things that ideologically created America, that philosophically created America, that the founding fathers of America read and were inspired by these philosophies to build the Constitution of the United States. Are you with me? On that you will find what's written up there is ancient Greece, Rome, Christianity, and till this day it says Islam. Islam heavily influenced the founding fathers of the United States because of its law, and I will explain this over the next few nights. This was 1700s I'm talking about. 1776 is the Declaration of Independence in the United States. 1789 is the French Revolution, the declaration in there. I'm telling you this over 200 years ago, the founding fathers were not Muslims. We're saying Islam has elements that we need to look at. And one of the biggest elements is that Islam told us to fight for the rights of everybody. And that's something that's very important. So now, you, as an individual, are in a position where someone on the other side of the world would kill or die to be in your place. In terms of the resources that you have, in terms of the opportunities that you have, in terms of X, Y, and Z that you have. So the question is, are you going towards Kamal or not? Or are you selling yourself short? Allah said that you are His best creation. Are you living up to that? And if you're not, we have work to do. I have work to do. I'm with you on this. Whatever you strive to do in life, strive for excellence. So now based on this, you should be a role model for the future of our community within whatever capacity that you can. Now stay with me here. So this was the main element of understanding this is not just ritualistic coming here and just filling and checking the boxes. We need to be thinking about what we're doing here. Number one. Number two, in the real conversation that I really want to build on here is exactly this. That is, What is the role of women in Islam? And this is so important because in our world today, many people don't know much about Islam, and so they hear things and they start saying, this is what Islam is all about. And it's important for you and I to know what we believe, otherwise someone else is going to come tell us what we believe. And if someone comes and tells us what we believe, we'll be like, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, and we start, maybe not the first time, but the second, third, fourth time, eventually we start believing them. And what I'm seeing as a speaker, and what you may have already seen as well, is many young people have had to deal with this. They're saying, Islam says this, do you believe this? And they're like, I don't know, I'm not sure. And eventually, they intellectually disconnect. You see, there's many people here, but I often have this conversation that throughout Muharram, alhamdulillah, you get good attendance. But outside of Muharram, it's not always consistent, and there are reasons for that, but at the same time, what is our retention rate in our communities? As in, our KPIs, in terms of how many people are we keeping here, number one. Number two, how many people are engaged? That is, how many people are coming in, number one. Number two, how many people are physically here, but mentally, they're not. There's some people maybe like that here right now. And the reality of the matter is, just because someone comes doesn't necessarily mean that we're adding value to their life. We need to consider these things. So the next thing that I want to discuss with you is, we need to know our religion, otherwise someone's going to start telling us our narrative, and that doesn't end well usually. So what is this all about? I want to look at a few things with you tonight. Number one, what is it that Islam's vision was to reform the society in which it had come, and what did Islam say about the rights of women, and how did this compare and contrast with what was happening before, number one. Number two, what is it that is an understanding of why Islam had a certain vision for the role of women, and how is it sometimes we don't even understand what that vision was, and sometimes it's much more accommodating and respectful and engaging than the broader society. Number three, what is it with respect to the role of women in early Islam and also in later Islam? And finally, what does this have to do with the message and the mission of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and Imam al-Zamana alayhi salam? Is there any role of women in that movement or not? And how did this become clear on the plains of Karbala? This is our agenda for tonight. Wherever you are, here in Melbourne or across the globe, Sallu salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Recall the family structure. Now remember, family, madrasa, member, company. Now when I say this, each one has a stake about community development model. Number one is the family. The family structure needs to be strong. Then the madrasa, all of these have to happen in parallel. So you need a madrasa team, and you need to support that madrasa team. You also need the member majalis to complement and supplement what's going on. But also there needs to be, for the company aspect, that is the people around you, there needs to be a strong youth committee. There needs to be a strong committee for people who are in their teens, 20s, 30s, to inspire you to be the best that you can be and bring each of you along the journey together. So what is it that the youth committee here, for example, and the broader Melbourne society and Australian society, what are the goals? What are the objectives? What are the tasks that you're doing? What are the achievements? What's your aspirations? What are your dreams? What are your visions? How can you help people locally? How can you help people at the state level? How can you help people internationally? These are big questions, but someone has to solve it. And if we as followers of Ahlul Bayt don't, then who will? So it's important for us to realize the holistic nature of Islam. Now this is the first dimension of the equation. Second dimension of the equation, one of these allegations with respect to that is not understanding what Islam's vision was. Come with me on a journey. The moment in time is Islam has just come. Rasulullah has announced Islam and he's sitting with some companions. And a discussion breaks out amongst his companions. Was there ever a time where you committed something or you did something that was stone-hearted? In Ayyam Jahiliyyah. So now, they were in the era of ignorance before Ayyam Jahiliyyah. Islam had come and eventually it was being spread and shared. And now people had become Muslim. Remember, Karen Armstrong in her book, Muhammad, a prophet for our time, she said Muhammad came to remove Jahl. If you recall, for some of you who are in one of the other majalis that I was reciting, the opposite of deen And this notion of is not dunya. We say deen and dunya, and we think of them as opposites. The opposite of deen is jahl. Deen came to remove jahl, ignorance. So when you come to this dynamic of the equation, they were discussing, was there something? So one of these people gathered the courage and he said, yes, there was one thing. And Rasulullah sitting there. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I want to tell you something. Before Islam, I was in a very difficult state. And he proceeded to tell Rasulullah and the companions. He said, what is it? What tell us, what happened? He said, before Islam, in Ayyam Jahiliyyah, in the era of ignorance, what happened was, there was a battle going on between tribes. We were the tribes of Hijaz, Makkah, Medina is called Hijaz, and the tribes of Iraq had come to us. And we had a battle, and we fought. And when we fought, the Iraqi tribes won. They won the battle. And when they won the battle, they took the women from Hijaz, and they said, look, you have a choice. You can either come as slaves or you can marry somebody from the Iraqi tribes. So they gave them this choice. And so they took the women and they took them on the other side. So this companion is telling Rasulullah, and all the companions are listening and they're hearing this. He said that when they did this, eventually after some years, many years, there was a peace treaty that was brokered. The peace treaty happened between the tribes of Iraq and the tribes of Hijaz after a long time. When the peace treaty happened, they said, look, you had your daughters that we took. Now some of them, they married here and they live here and they're staying with their families. These are their new families. So we're giving them the choice. Do they want to leave and go to you, or do they want to stay back with their new families? It's up to them. So he said that my daughter happened to choose to stay with her new family in Iraq. She didn't come back. At that point in time, he says, I made the decision that any daughter that I have that is ever born after that, because of this insult to his ego, he said that I will bury her alive. So every time his wife had a daughter, she would bury her alive. This Ayyam Jahiliyyah. It's very difficult. The Quran says, وَإِذَا الْمَوْعُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. The verse that I recited at the beginning, that Allah says, on that day, the newborn baby girl will cry out, for which sin was I killed? On the day of judgment, she'll complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for which sin was I killed? What did I do that caused me to be killed? Now I know I'm talking about this, but stay with me here. There's not a single male here who is not touched in some way by a lady in terms of their life, in terms of either them being their mother, their sister, their relative in some way or shape or form. So this is a conversation for all of us to be having, because it's in the interest of the future of our society. Now stay with me here. When this happened, he said, I made this commitment one after the other. Every time a daughter was born, I buried her alive. One day, he's telling Rasulullah, one day eventually I went on a journey, a business trip. He said, when I went on a business trip, my wife was expecting while I went on this business trip. And on the way back, when I came back, I was expecting that maybe she had delivered or about to deliver. And when I came back home, I realized that she did not have any signs of pregnancy. I imagined that she delivered. So I said, where's the child? She said, the child died in birth. It was stillborn. The child did not make it. I said, okay, fine. So he moved on with his life. One day passed, 2 days passed, 3 days passed. Eventually a year or two passed, several years passed. This happened. He says, Ya Rasulullah, eventually we had a situation where we didn't have these kids, but my wife needed help in the house. And when she needed help in the house, she would get help from the neighbor. They had a daughter. And so he said, she would say, can you come and help us once in a while? We really appreciate it. We're getting older. People did this at the time. Nowadays you can't get people to work at home, let alone the neighbor's house. But that was happening at the time. So at that point she said she would come. And the father would be sitting there and he would just be doing his work and he would notice her come and go. But over time, when she would come and do these things, he would start smiling and say, welcome, thank you for all your help. And he started getting an affinity. And so she would go home at night back to her house, as she was the neighbor. And one day, he says, Ya Rasulullah, I told my wife, you know, this neighbor's daughter of ours, I feel like a fatherly affection towards her. Meaning like, she's been, excuse me, coming so often, it feels like she's like, like one of my nieces. It feels like she's like family in some sense. And so the wife, she said, really? I said, yeah, I don't know what it is, but I just feel like she's connected somehow. I said, really? She didn't say anything at that time. One day passed, 2 days passed, 3 days passed, and eventually she saw an opportunity, the wife. She said, you know, my husband, and this is just as the neighbor's daughter left. She said, you don't remember you had said that you feel an affection towards this, like she's your own daughter or like she's your own niece? You remember you feel affection towards this young girl who helps us out? I said, yeah. He said, I need to tell you something. I said, sit down. I said, okay. So he sat down and said, you remember you were traveling a long time ago? And you had gone on a business trip? I said, yes. And I was expecting? I said, yes. And when you got back, you were expecting a child, but I was not, so I had no signs of pregnancy, and the child was not there, and I told you it was stillborn. I said, yeah. I said, well, just a couple of days ago you told me about your affection for this child, and I wanted to tell you that the child was not stillborn. It was born, healthy, and it was a baby girl. But I could not take that you would bury another girl alive. So I gave this daughter to the neighbors to raise. That daughter, that girl who comes, is our daughter. But I didn't have the courage to tell you. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I heard my wife say this. But that night, I stayed up the whole night. Because my heart was telling me one thing, and my honor was telling me something else, or my ego was telling me something else. That I had given my word that any daughter that is born, will be buried. And so he went before this, in his heart back and forth, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? And the companions are on the edge of their seat. They're saying, what would happen? He said, the next day came, and when the next day came, when the neighbor's daughter came into the house, who I realized was now my daughter, I got up before my wife, and I said, let's go for a walk. And we went outside. And when we went outside, we went towards the desert. And when we went towards the desert, I began to dig a hole into the ground. And I dug, and I dug, and I dug, until I threw this daughter of mine into the ground. And I began to throw sand over her. And as I was doing this, she began to call out, as she knew. She said, Baba, my father, you're my father. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me? Until there was no more sound. He said, I did this and I went back. The narration says Rasulullah's eyes were like rivers by this time. He was crying so much. He said, this is the act of a hard-hearted nation. And Allah's rahmah never comes on a hard-hearted nation. You see, this man was not able to break away from the slavery and the shackles of his ego, to do what he knew his heart was saying was right, to forgive, to move on, to have this child. Rasulullah said, this is why Islam came. To emancipate people, to free them from the shackles of slavery of the world and the society. Now keep this on one side. One moment that I want you to never forget. It's on the plains of Karbala. And it's that moment, and I'm not at Masayib yet, but remember this. Imam al-Hussain is known as Abul Ahrar. Why? The father of freedom, of the free man. If you want liberty, if Australian, Canadian, American, British society, we tout liberty and we tout freedom, which is beautiful. But if you want freedom in the truest sense, you must study Muhammad, you must study Hussain. Imam al-Hussain is on the plains of Karbala. They don't know if he's dead or alive, the enemies. And Umar ibn Sa'ad says, I know how. ordered to loot the tents of the women and children. When he orders to loot the tents of the women and children, they don't know if Imam Hussain is alive or dead because it's his final moments. He's not moving. But at that point, the narration says, Imam supported himself on his elbows. And he gave a cry out and he called out to the army on the other side of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, of Yazid, of Umar ibn Sa'd, and said, look, what did he say? إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ دِينٌ وَلَا تَخَافُونَ الْمَعَادِ فَكُونُوا أَحْرَارًا فِي دُنْيَاكُمْ. So if you have no belief, and you have no religion, and you have no belief in the hereafter, if you don't believe in any of that, at least be free in this world. Imam al-Hussain, I beg of you and I put my hands together and I ask you, those people that you're talking to, those people, they have the horses, they have the army, they have the money, they have the weapons, they have the kingdom, so to speak. They have everything from the worldly perspective. And you're telling them to be free? By the society of the time, they were the most free people. But Imam Hussain said, no, they were slaves. They were complete slaves to their desires. Umar ibn Sa'd, la'natullah, why did he want to do, what did he say? Imam Hussain has a conversation with him before the battle and he says, don't you know who I am? Don't you know your father, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he knows who I am. As in Rasulullah, according to the Muslim world, they say he's part of the Ashra Mubashara, his father, Umar ibn Sa'd's father. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is one of the 10 granted paradise, according to the riwayat you'll find amongst the Muslims. So he said, you don't know? He said, yes, I know everything. He said, then why? He said, because I've been promised the governorship of Rai. Modern day Tehran. I'm going to get that place. But subhanAllah, Allah's plan. You think, always validate your assumptions. You think something, and he thought that he'll get Rai. And he thought he'll kill Fatima al-Zahra's son, and he killed Fatima al-Zahra's son, and he did not get Rai. He never got it. And he got eternal damnation, eternal Jahannam. All because someone promised him, cheated him out of that. So keep these things in mind. Now come back to this and stay with me. Imam Hussain realized that they were slaves. You know, I went to Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles there's a museum. It's called the Getty. In that museum, there was some modern art. And the modern art had, from the distance, it was a frame and it had logos on it. You know, like brands, logos, like, you know, some of the car brands. I don't want to start taking names because some of you may have these or are wearing these. So these types of logos that are very famous in society. Some of shoes, some of cars, some of these things, the brand names, you know. And I said, how is this art? And then I started going closer. And I started going closer. And I started going closer. And as I got closer to the artwork, I noticed there were tiny chains all around the logos. Chains, you know chains? They were all around like a zanjir, all around the logos. And I said, what is this? Is so interesting. And I looked at the title. As you know, sometimes they write the title of the artwork. And the artist had written the title of the artwork. It said, materialism. And I said, I got it. And that's indeed what it is. You and I need to be mindful of this society. Do I just take what society says blindly, or do I think about it and actually contemplate and analyze it? Remember this, and I'll use this example in the next couple of nights, it will help you. There is a drift in society. If you've ever been to the water, if you've ever been to a river, if you've ever been to the ocean, imagine yourself in the ocean, and the shore is very far away. You're in the ocean. And there's no boats, there's nothing around for miles. And you're there. And let's say you are just floating at the top of the surface. Whether you know it or not, after 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, you may be very far away from where you started and you don't even realize it. The same thing happens in a society. If you go to a country or like the Caribbean, there's a culture there. The culture there is take it easy, lay back, generally speaking. There's always exceptions. And that culture has an impact on you, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. If you go to Silicon Valley in America, there's a culture there. The drift is, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, he grew up in that environment. He was raised in that environment. And so the culture there is do a startup, do business, work, do a tech startup. It's in the air. New York, I was in Seattle, which is where Microsoft and Amazon are based, and I was lecturing there. So I was at the car rental location, and I'm making small talk with the person who's there. And I'm getting my car, and said, they asked me where I was from. I said, I'm from Florida. They said, well, I said, where are you from? I said, oh, I'm from Los Angeles. I said, Los Angeles, okay. So what was so different? What was the big difference moving from Los Angeles to Seattle? They said the pace. Pace? Meaning what? He said it's much faster in Los Angeles, much slower in Seattle. It's much more relaxed. I said, what would someone, if that's the case, this is more relaxed than Los Angeles, then what would someone from New York do in Seattle? They'd be in a mess. Because often, the West Coast is considered relaxed. What I'm saying is each place has a culture. New York is considered very fast-paced. And so what I'm telling you is the environment has an impact on you for better or for worse. We in America oftentimes have workaholism. We work too much, it's extremism. Other places have very relaxed, take it easy, way, sometimes too much, maybe, I don't know. It's a society thing. All I'm telling you to do is be aware. And sometimes we know these things and sometimes we don't. I'm racing the clock now. Come back with me here. I'm leaving everything here. But stay with me here. This is what was happening before. But I want us to give rise to a generation of brothers and sisters who have the confidence in their belief to be able to have knowledge, to be able to explain to people what true Islam is. And I want to give you the example of Tawakkul Karman, number 2, second element of this equation. Tawakkul Karman is a lady who won the Nobel Prize, a Muslim lady wearing full hijab. And when she was interviewed in front of all of the media of the world, they asked her, they said, Tawakkul Karman, you won the Nobel Prize, you're world renowned, you did amazing things, but can you just answer a question? What is it? This scarf that you have, this covering that you have on your head, is this not backwards? Is this not regressive? Is this not ancient? Like from the Stone Age, or people way back in the day should have been wearing this, but why are you wearing this today? Her answer still baffles me till this day. This is logic, knowledge, wisdom, and courage, and confidence. She said, when people emerged, many people would get nervous. You look at what she said. She said, when mankind emerged on this planet, when human beings came on this planet, they wore very little clothes. They didn't wear much clothes when they first came on this planet. But as the intellect began to develop more and more, people began to wear more clothes. And so what I am doing here represents the height of the human intellect. To remove it would be to go back to the Stone Age. The person's jaw dropped, he had no response. You see, in our world, the world has moved to an environment where the arguments win. Logic is supposed to win. Debating is supposed to win. You need to, and I need to, work together to inculcate this sense of confidence. And this ability to have some confidence in your identity, number one. Number two, when it comes to the followers of Ahlul Bayt in particular, it's very important for us to remember that we have role models that are immaculate at the third level. We have Imam Ali, Rasulullah, Imam Ali, Imam Hussain, these great role models, phenomenal role models. Rasulullah, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Hussain. But, right in parallel with these personalities, at the same time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where He's given us Muhammad and Ali and Hussain, He has also given us Khadija, Fatima and Zainab, who are immense role models. And the ulama say, there are traits that Fatima, that Lady Khadija, that Fatima, salamullahi alayha, and Zainab, salamullahi alayha, they have that are not feminine traits or masculine traits, there are human traits. For example, what? For example, knowledge. For example, generosity. For example, courage. The courage of Zainab. Who is there to speak about and understand the courage of Zainab? The poet says, Khatum hai fasle kama bol rahi hai Zainab, aur kaun bolega jahan bol rahi hai Zainab. Tiro shamshiro sinahon ke sitam ke lashkar, thak gayi sabki zaban bol rahi hai Zainab. Thak gayi sabki zaban बोल रही है ज़ैनब, और ऐ यजीद इससे बड़ी हार तेरी क्या होगी, ऐ यजीद इससे बड़ी हार तेरी क्या होगी, वो तेरा घर है जहां बोल रही है ज़ैनब, वो तेरा घर है. This ability for Zainab to look the enemy in the eye and to give him a response that he was not able to respond to at his own house is only Zainab who can do this. Now I'm telling you this because Islam really elevated this position of women. I want to share something with you in terms of this maqam of these personalities. As you know, Maryam, Asiya, Khadija salamullahi alayha, and Fatima al-Zahra are the women of paradise, the most exalted. But I want to share something with you that you want to reflect. They asked Sayyid Khomeini rahmatullahi alayhi, can you say something about the personality of Fatima al-Zahra? Allahu Akbar. These scholars had an amazing way. He said, you know, she is too great for me to say anything about her. But if you really want to know, I'll tell you something. He says, in my research, I have not come across anyone else other than her who meets this criteria. He said, what is the criteria? What does it say? He said, in Usul al-Kafi, you will find an authentic tradition. As you know, there are 4 books that you should know as followers of Ahlul Bayt. Al-Kafi, Man La Yahdharu al-Faqih, Tahzeeb and Istibsar. These are our 4 books of hadith that are the most reputable ones in our school of thought. Our brothers in Ahl Sunnah, there are 6 books, as you know, right? Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Sunnah Abi Dawud, Nasai, and the likes. That's their set. Our set is the 4 that I just mentioned. So in Al-Kafi, which is considered the most authentic, there's a narration that when Rasulullah, Sayyid Khomeini is saying this, when Rasulullah passed away, after he passed away, Fatima al-Zahra was crying very much. It was very difficult. For 75 days, Jibreel would come and console her and give her condolences and ease her heart. He says, I don't know of any other individual other than an imam or a prophet who Jibreel came to console other than Fatima al-Zahra. Number 1. Number 2, and never forget this, is a gift for tonight. Ayatollah Najafi Mar'ashi has the largest library in Asia. He spent his whole life dedicated to books. He wrote a wasiyah, a will. There's a private one and a public one. I want you to read the public will. He mentioned, for example, I have a handkerchief that I would cry for Hussein in every majlis. Bury me with that. And there's beautiful points, but one thing that I want to mention. He said in those 25 points, Ayatollah Najafi Mar'ashi, 3 of these points, all had to do with Fatima al-Zahra directly. He said, number 1, I want you, he's telling his son in his wasiyah, I want you to make sure you memorize the khutbah fadakiyah, the khutbah fadak of Fatima al-Zahra, memorize it. You know, the Sadat and the Shia, whenever they had to leave, they would always, no matter what they did, at a bare minimum, they would make sure that they memorized the khutbah fadakiyah. This was part of their identity. Even when they had to move from place to place. So he said, number 1, he said, read it, learn it, memorize it, analyze it, the khutbah fadakiyah. He said some of the greatest linguists and intellectuals of the Arabic language have neglected it. Never neglected it, number 1. Number 2, he said, my son, make sure you always recite the tasbih of Fatima al-Zahra. And not only after salah, but in any difficulty that you may be in. Because Rasulullah gave this to Fatima al-Zahra when she needed it. And if there was something greater than this, he would have given that. So know, this is something to help you in difficult times. And in any times, number 2. Number 3, he says, never forget in the qunut of your salah to say بحق فاطمة وأبيها وبعلها وبنيها وسر المستودع فيها. This notion that by Fatima and her father and her husband and the secret with which she is buried, that secret will be known on Yawm al-Qiyamah. We don't know. But the maqam of Fatima is exalted. Don't take my word for it. Iqbal again. Iqbal, I've told you, not necessarily from the followers of Ahlul Bayt. We don't know. But his aqaid was better than many people. He says in poetry, Maryam az yek nisbat Isa aziz, as seh nisbat Hazrat Zahra aziz. So for 1 reason Maryam is exalted. For 3 reasons, Fatima al-Zahra is exalted. Noor-e chashma-e rahmatan lil alameen, on imam-e awwaleen wa akhareen. Her father is who? Her father is Rasulullah, the imam of all the prophets. He's the Sayyid of all of the prophets. Adam to Khatam, he is the Khatam. And then he continues. Banwayan Tajdar Halata. Murtaza Mushkil Kusha Shere Khuda. And he says that her husband is the one who has the crown of Halata. Now, if you don't know, understand this. Halata is referring to Surah Dahr, Surah Insan, where Allah says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Hal ata ala al-insani hinam min ad-dahri lam yakun shay'an mazkura. And Allah continues, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَحَسِيرًا. That is, they give. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first says, does man not recall there was a time where he was not worth mentioning? And then after that, they give what Allah has given them. They do infaq. They give what Allah has given them out of their love to the poor, the orphan, the wayfarer. And all Muslims accept this was in honor of Ali, Fatima, Hassan and Hussein, when the poor, the orphan and the wayfarer came to their door. So when you ask where are the Ahlul Bayt in the Quran, they're right there in the Quran. All of Surah Dahr, Surah Insan is for Ahlul Bayt and many other places. But this is something. And then he continues on in his long qasida in honor of Fatima al-Zahra. And he says, for example, her son is a qafila salare, caravan ishq. That is, he's the one who's leading the journey. And he's referring to Imam Hussain alayhi salam. But some people think that, is Iqbal saying that, Fatima is great because her father is Rasulullah, her husband is Imam Ali, her son is Imam Hussein. It sounds like he's not exact. And no. When people actually analyze this, scholars who analyze poets, they say, in fact, it seems that Iqbal is saying, no, these great men don't become great men without a support like Fatima al-Zahra. That is, Fatima is the one who is known as Abiha, if you know. That is when nobody could console Rasulullah and help Rasulullah in the early days of Islam. Rasulullah is in the vicinity of the Kaaba praying, they threw an intestine of a sheep on Rasulullah. And no Muslim could help because they would kill them. The only reason Rasulullah they didn't kill Rasulullah was because of Abu Talib. Nonetheless, when this happened at this point in time, eventually Fatima al-Zahra heard as a young girl, and she raced to Rasulullah, removed the filth and cleaned him off. When Rasulullah would go to Ta'if for tabligh, they would pelt Rasulullah with stones and he would bleed. When he would come back, Fatima al-Zahra would clean off the wounds. And many other examples that go further on this journey. Now stay with me and we'll wrap up right here. Look, Fatima is Fatima. As Dr. Ali Shariati both very beautifully said, maybe expanding what Iqbal was thinking, and he made it clear what Iqbal meant perhaps. And Dr. Ali Shariati said, I want you to write that Fatima is the daughter of Khadija. I want you to write that Fatima is the daughter of Muhammad. I want you to write that Fatima is the mother of Hassan. I want you to write that Fatima is the mother of Hussein. I want you to write that Fatima is the mother of Zainab. I want you to write all of this until it was only that I wrote, Fatima is Fatima and no other. She's her own person. And the final thing that I want to mention to you at the fourth level is this. Do women have a role in the movement of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and Imam Zaman? There's a lady, there's a riwayah which I want to share with you. Rasulullah is on Mi'raj. Mi'raj, as you know, Rasulullah was called to the heavens, to the vicinity of Allah. The Quran says, ثُمَّ دَنَا فَتَضَلَّ فَكَانَ قَابَ قَوْسَيْنِ أَوْ أَدْنَى. That he drew nearer and nearer up until it was the point that he was 2 bows or less distance from the proximity of Allah. Ya Allah, why did you say that he got closer and closer up until the point that he was 2 bows away? 2 bows. You know bow and arrow? Come on, dear, this bow and arrow. He says 2 bows or less. According to Sahib Tafsir al-Kabir, he says the reason for this was this. He says that the reason for this was simply this. In Arabia at that time, if 2 chieftains wanted to show their unity, they would put 2 bow and arrows together, and they would put 2 bows together and shoot 1 arrow together in the distance. The symbolism was that this gesture shows that tribe A and tribe B are united. Their fight is my fight, your war is my war, your peace is my peace. And so Allah was saying, according to Fakhruddin al-Razi inside the Tafsir al-Kabir, he says that Allah was saying that, based on this, that Muhammad, your war is my war, your peace is my peace. Now in that Mi'raj, Jibreel says to Rasulullah he smells a fragrance. He smells a beautiful fragrance. When he smells this beautiful fragrance, the narration says that Rasulullah says, Jibreel, what is this fragrance I'm smelling? Say, Ya Rasulullah, these are the ashes of Siana. Shall I tell you about her? Now Rasulullah knows, but for you and I to know today, he says, yes, tell me. He said it happened during the time of Musa and Fir'aun. Musa was in the house of Fir'aun, growing up in the house of Fir'aun under Asiya, and in that house, Fir'aun's daughter was going to get her hair done, her hairdress. And in the house, in the palace, they had a hairdresser who was from the family. She was the wife of Hiskil. You know, in Ezekiel they say in the Bible, Hiskil, the wife of Hiskil was the one who was making the hair of the daughter. Her name was Siana. So what happened was, Jibreel is telling Rasulullah, he said, Ya Rasulullah, and he's narrating for you and I to understand. So the daughter of Fir'aun is getting her hair dressed, and she has a comb or something like a comb. Siana has a comb or something like that in her hand, and it falls. When it falls, she says from her lips, automatically, instantaneously, extemporaneously, Bismillah. Now of course, Fir'aun had said, the Quran says, Ana Rabbukum al-A'la. He said, I'm the great Lord, he was saying that he was God. Fir'aun had said this. So nobody was allowed to believe in anyone except him. And so, when she heard Bismillah, she said, what did you just say? You don't believe that my father is the Lord? You believe in God? And she says, I believe in the one Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She doubled down. Now, the daughter went to tell Fir'aun right away, and she told Fir'aun. Now, anyone else, Fir'aun would have killed right away. But, this was a family matter, because Hiskil was a relative of Fir'aun. And so, by virtue, Siana was into the family. And so he said, look, I have to nip this in the bud and get this sorted out before anyone else finds out. So he ordered Hiskil to come. Hiskil, as they call it, the moment of Ali Fir'aun, or the moment who was in the house of Fir'aun. So he said, Hiskil, look, this happened today. My daughter went to get her hair dressed and your wife was there. She dropped her comb and she said, Bismillah. You need to get her to renounce this. Let's sweep this under the rug and not make this a bigger issue than it needs to be. Anyone else I would have killed. Hiskil says, very well. I'll talk to her and I'll let you know. He says, my wife, this happened today. You dropped the comb, you said Bismillah. I was told by Fir'aun this is the case. He said, yes, this happened. He said, what is he saying? He's saying that you need to renounce it. You need to say, I didn't mean this. I didn't mean to say that. This is what you need to say publicly. Seek forgiveness. He said, I can't. No. At that point in time, Hiskil said, this is what it is. At that point in time, he said, very well. Fir'aun ordered for a furnace, a fire to be built. And when he ordered for the fire to be built, he said, call Siana. But he said, call Siana and also call all of her children. She had a few children, including a newborn. He said, renounce. Fir'aun said to Siana, renounce what you said. She said, no. He took the first child, threw it into the furnace. Renounce. No. Second. Third. Up until the narration says she had a newborn child in her hand, and then they were taking the newborn child. Now remember, this is a different level. This is not for you and I. This test is for others who are at a higher spiritual level. Allah gives tests to people according to their ability and capability. Ibrahim's test is different than your test and my test. The likes of these people is different. But in this context, this was her test. So she was, when they began to take the baby from her hands, the narration says she was beginning to feel like maybe I should relinquish. Maybe now I should renounce what I said. And then the baby spoke the same way Isa ibn Maryam spoke from the cradle and said that my mother, you are on the right path. So she didn't let go, and they took the mother and the child and they threw them both in the furnace. Jibreel says, Ya Rasulullah, this beautiful fragrance that you smell, these are the ashes of Siana that have been scattered in the ground, in the earth. He's here on Mi'raj. This same Siana, we have riwayat that when Imam-e-Zaman comes, 313 companions you'll have, or commanders, generals you'll have. but of those, 50 will be women. And of them, we have names of certain people who will be amongst them. For example, who? For example, the mother of Ammar bin Yasir, Sumayya, the mother of Ammar bin Yasir, is one of the people mentioned by name. When Islam first came, they tortured her. She is one of the first people, number one. They have the likes of Qanwa, the daughter of Rushayd al-Hajari. I'll come to in a moment. And of course, Siyana is one of those people mentioned by name as one of the companions of the Imam of the time. So women have this tremendous role. There's so much to say, so little time, I'm done. I'm going to Masai. But remember, the Ahlul Bayt told us, as a follower of Ahlul Bayt, there must be mutual respect between the husband and the wife. A follower, a Haydari, can never raise a hand on a lady. If you read the history, the enemies of Ahlul Bayt did this. But at the same time, abuse goes both ways, by the way. There can be abuse that's not even physical, it can be psychological. It can be emotional. And that's also something that's happening, unfortunately. Sometimes it's the sisters, sometimes it's the brothers. We should have harmonious, loving relationships. And we pray that we do. Women have a great role, and women are the ones who gave rise to the likes of Qasim. Farwa gave rise to the likes of Qasim. And the likes of Layla gave rise to Ali ibn Akbar. Ajrukum ala Allah. I don't know how to recite tonight's Masahib between me and you. Because when you read it, the Masahib from the Maqtal, and what happened to Imam Hussain, you wish that you would die perhaps. Ajrukum ala Allah. They came to Imam al-Sadiq and said, Yabna Rasulullah, what is the greatest zina? What is the greatest ornament of this life? That if Allah gives someone this, it is as if Allah has given them one of the best things in life in terms of the worldly life. He says the number one thing that from the worldly perspective is zinat, ornament of this life. He says if Allah gives you a son or a child, and that son grows up in front of your eyes, and he is a pious, muttaqi, tranquil, good person, and when people see him in society, they remember you and they see how good is this father, how good is this mother, how good is this, and they see that person, and they see that, you see that. He says Allah has given the greatest gift. And then he asked a difficult question. He said, Yabna Rasulullah, Imam al-Sadiq, what is the greatest tragedy in life? He says the greatest tragedy in life is if Allah takes this same son away from you.